Welcome to this so-called instant reaction case study video about an incident I just found out about this morning concerning Piper Archer November 935 Delta Echo. It had a wake turbulence encounter near JFK 2 days ago. That wake turbulence encounter apparently shook the battery compartment enough that it created an onboard electrical fire. For the record, I'm filming this just 2 days later on January 27th of 2021. What I found remarkable about this one is that this one actually crosses about at least 2, if not 3, different kinds of emergencies that I've already built into the project, so I want to draw attention to that. Essentially, the JFK tower controller who was working the airplane did a fantastic job. I'm not really going to per se comment on what the controller says. I'm here more to compare what happened with the kind of stuff that I've already built in the course. So let's get started. So the standard caveats for these things, I'll generally film these very quickly once I find out about it. The discussions could be based on what is publicly available to me, which might not exactly end up being what turns out to be the case. So for discussion purposes, we're going to focus on what's publicly known. The goal is to improve controller training, and so what I'm really trying to do is focus on trying to assess whether the kinds of things that I'm building on the website in good faith will help with the kinds of emergencies that might be encountered, including one that just happened 2 days ago. All right. So the basic situation, this came to my attention on one of these Voz Aviation videos. I also quickly checked the flight track available to me on FlightAware and FlightRadar24.com. Nothing particularly new in those two sites. The basic facts are these. The airplane was proceeding westbound VFR at low level for some New York City sightseeing. The controller advised the pilot. The pilot had the 777 in sight, but the Archer passed underneath, perpendicular to, and behind the Air France 777 landing on 4 right. Shortly after he encountered the wake turbulence, he declared an emergency with smoke. He diverted to JFK. As indicated, the JFK tower controller did an absolutely textbook job. I'm not here to critique that per se. And the pilot then later spoke of possible electrical issues, including maybe the need to shut the electrics off. So let's kind of watch the video and get some sense of what happened here. I'm going to pause it here. Nope. It outsmarted me. I'm going to pause it here, and it does happen occasionally, seems to happen a little bit more, where people are submitting information about their own incidents with a link maybe to the liveatc.net audio to Victor, who then puts together the radar replays with the technology he's developed. And so this is actually written by the pilot, whose name is Samuel. And he explains what happened. It caused the aircraft's battery to shift around in the back of the airplane, and the fire itself took place right underneath my elevator and rudder control cables, which may have led to a control failure, and so they were able to land safely. I know it says I provided the ATC recording below from Kennedy Tower. Skip to this time. That was the note he sent to Victor, who is the guy who runs this channel. We're going to pick up with a much shorter thing. I'm going to kind of avoid the setup for this with calling the traffic in advance so the pilot understands what's going on. We'll pick up about here and watch about 3 minutes worth.
Okay, so that's the 048 from 006 Cities. 5 Delta Echo, last aircraft that just passed, he's now head heavy 777, crossing Lake Turbulence. Crossing Lake Turbulence for 777, 5 Delta Echo. 5 Delta Echo, if you'd like to climb out of below 1,400 is approved for the Bravo.
Into the Bravo, out of below 1,500, 5 Delta Echo, thank you.
Hello Kennedy, JetBlue 710's with you, 4 right.
710, can you get afternoon, heavy 777 rolling out, crossing away turbulence, runway 4 right, clear to land with 0505.
Clear to land 4 right, JetBlue 710.
Air France 6 Heavy, continue on Foxtrot, cross runway 4 left, then turn left on out.
Okay, we continue on the first approach, we cross 04 left, and continue on Alpha from 00.
Kennedy Tower, 5 Delta Echo, we experienced a lot of turbulence from that 777. There's smoke in the cockpit, we're going to like an emergency landing.
5 Delta Echo, Roger, do you have Kennedy in sight?
Yeah, we have Kennedy in sight.
5 Delta Echo, proceed, direct numbers running 4 left, clear to land, vehicles be on their way.
Very decisive, quick reaction, and I do like, for the record, that we're not trying to find out too many details about the nature of the emergency. Something like this, pilot wants to make an immediate landing, has the airport in sight, clear him to land, probably get out of the way, roll the vehicles. Anything we do to try to get more information at this point is likely going to distract the pilot when they're in a very high workload situation.
Clear to land 4 left, 5 Delta Echo.
Attention all emergency equipment respond to an alert 2 runway 4 left. Attention all emergency equipment respond to alert 2 runway 4 left. San Francisco City, please expedite.
Please expedite is over there.
5 Delta Echo, if 1-3 left is easier for you, both are available. Excuse me, 1-3 right is available also, if it's easier, 5 Delta Echo.
Okay, we're going to make a right base for 1-3 right, 5 Delta Echo.
5 Echo, clear, big report turning 1-3 right. When they 1-3 right, clear to land, emergency equipment is on the way.
1-3 right, clear to land, 5 Delta Echo.
And all emergency equipment respond now to a call of runway 1-3 right, alert 2, runway 1-3 right now for an emergency inbound of runway 1-3 right. All emergency equipment respond. San Francisco 7, monitor ground, good day.
Monitor ground from 050, bye-bye.
Kennedy Tower, Delta 9961 with you on a still. So 4 right.
Delta 9961, Kennedy running 4 right, clear to land, wind 0305.
Clear to land 4 right, Delta 9961.
Okay, I didn't get a response for any of the rescue trucks on vehicle. Just be advised, subject aircraft is number 1 on a 2-mile base, runway 1-3 right.
Kennedy Tower, Piper 5 Delta Echo, do you read?
5 Echo, copy you loud and clear.
It seems like we're having some electrical issues. I might want to turn off the battery to prevent a fire.
5 Echo, copy that. The subject aircraft may not have comms available. He's turned off his electric equipment.
I'm going to go ahead and end here for the sake of time. But as this is an electrical situation, the pilot does like so many pilots does. He advises us that he might turn the battery off. I can't vouch for what pilots will do, but I will say that prudent pilots really should, they don't always do this, they really should just go ahead and turn it off, exercise their PIC authority, and clearly that's going to make it a little harder for us to know what's going on when we suddenly lose the transponder and they're suddenly not answering us on the radio because they've turned the electrical situation or the electrical system off. But ideally that's what pilots should be doing in a lot of these cases. So very quickly, just some relevant Indy Center in-flight emergency project videos I've put together already. One is the post-upset checklist for what happens after somebody has gone through a wake turbulence encounter. Now obviously this situation is a little bit different, but this is a reminder that when somebody experiences some kind of extreme turbulence event, whether it's wake turbulence or something like severe clear air turbulence or something, all kinds of weird things can happen, and that's why the concept of a post-upset checklist is presented on the website. For electrical failures and fires, I talk about more traditional methods, as it were, of starting an electrical fire. But among other things, these systems can start to shut down on their own as the electrical fire progresses, as wiring burns through, and so on. By the way, that can happen with other kinds of fires as well. But also, when a pilot suspects an electrical fire, one of the first things pilots really should do is go ahead and shut the master switch off, and that's just going to be tough for us controllers and so on. And just very briefly, I don't want to make a big deal about this, but understanding the minimum required information, I've not actually filmed that video yet, but I want to point out that we all as controllers know the minimum required information: aircraft ID and type, nature of the emergency, pilot's intentions. On rare occasions there are exceptions when you don't even need that much minimum required information. You've got somebody 2 miles from the airport who says smoke in the cockpit, need an emergency landing, and you clear him to land. That's sufficient and so on. We knew the airplane ID. Even if we didn't know exactly the type for whatever reason, and I think we did here, I wouldn't go and find out if we didn't know for some reason, okay? And as far as the exact nature of the emergency, all we have is smoke in the cockpit. It would be nice to refine that, know what kind of fire, but you know what? This guy's only, a mile or two out. He's got to be busy landing the airplane. That's just a detail that's going to have to go unanswered. And then related to that, the fuel on board, people on board questions, which as a reminder are not officially part of the minimum required information. I'm actually glad that the controller did not ask the pilot this because it's a critical time period when that was happening so intensely. We're going to compare this very briefly to 2 other incidents. One is Air Canada 797 way back in the early days of 1983. This was a DC-9 that landed at Cincinnati with fire in the lavatory. And for what it's worth, very briefly, let me just start with the Wikipedia page about this flight. This was from Dallas up to Montreal with an intermediate stop in Toronto. About the time they were coming up on the Louisville area, a fire developed behind the lavatory, and it's a little bit complicated about how the fire started. That doesn't per se concern us. I will say it started to burn through wiring and was creating all kinds of problems. They were able to make a successful emergency landing at Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport. However, for reasons we're not going to discuss, the air conditioning and pressurization system was affected during the emergency descent and so on, and that led to some buildup of smoke and fumes within the cabin. As soon as you land and brake to a stop, what's the first thing you do? You open the doors trying to get out of the airplane. Unfortunately, there was some irony. It's not that you could avoid this anyway. That created kind of a flashover condition. Some people were able to evacuate. However, there were 23 passengers who tragically were killed, unable to evacuate the aircraft. This was a landmark event, and so that's why we have smoke detectors in lavatories and other things associated with safety for in-flight fire situations. Okay, but having said that, let me go briefly to the NTSB official accident report. You'll notice that this one was completed in 1986 and it superseded the one from 1984. When the original one came out, my understanding off the top of my head is that the Airline Pilots Association petitioned the NTSB to reconsider some of its conclusions. The NTSB granted some of those, and so that's why this is actually the second and updated report and so on that we're going to look at. We're just going to kind of very briefly skim through some things. When the smoke was kind of first detected, they weren't quite sure what they had going on. The captain sent the first officer back to inspect the aft lavatory, and while he's gone for a couple minutes, that's when the captain first notices some electrical malfunctions. Okay, and so the captain told Indy Center to stand by because the flight had an electrical problem, and only about 45 seconds later, Indy Center lost the beacon target on the airplane because the wiring associated with the transponder was apparently already burning through. So the controller working the high altitude sector switched the radar display to include primary targets, and then we had a primary target on the aircraft. For reasons that won't concern us, that kind of complicated the handoff to Cincinnati approach under the very hasty emergency descent and so on, even though it occupies some of this report. Meantime, the first officer comes back after about 2 minutes. There are more lights that are warning lights that are illuminating, okay, and so on. The emergency AC and emergency DC electrical buses had lost power. The captain and first officer's attitude directional indicators tumbled. So the captain told the first officer to activate the emergency power switch. The gyros began erecting for the attitude directional indicators. However, because of the loss of AC power, the stabilizer trim was inoperative and remained so during the rest of the flight. If you remember what I called Flight 1 here on the website, what was like the one thing I wanted you to get more than anything else out of Flight 1 was the importance of pitch trim. These pilots lost their pitch trim. Now, in effect, this DC-9 was trimmed for cruise speed up at flight level 330, and so as they had to slow down for landing, they had to really muscle the airplane. So they were able to do it and so on, but that just gives you some sense of the many myriad effects that happen when something like a fire starts burning through electrical wiring. Every airplane will be different. Every situation will be different. Meantime, Captain tells Indy Center that he's declaring an emergency. He's changed the transponder code to 7700. However, the transponder unknown to the captain is inoperative at this point. And among other things, of course, Indy Center was not able to see the Mode C altitude information as the guy began a very rapid descent. There's a manual handoff on a primary target only to Cincinnati approach. I'm not going to get into the weeds on this one, but there was some confusion about the target. And initially, they were looking at a different target, thinking that was Air Canada. They were able to resolve it, but eventually, and I say eventually, it's very quickly, there were so many instruments failing that they had no navigation instruments, and unfortunately they still had comm, and the weather was, off the top of my head, ballpark 8,000 overcast. Well, what they had was then, basically without the navigational instruments and being on top of an overcast layer, the Cincinnati approach controller had to very hastily identify the airplane with an identifying turn, make sure he had positive radar contact, and then gave him kind of a very hasty no gyro approach, although they were able to break out a few thousand feet above the airport and break to a successful landing on what was then known as runway 27 left. So they came to a stop. As far as the landing goes, I'll note over here on page 8, when the captain sighted the runway, he extended the gear. Since the horizontal stabilizer was inoperative, the captain extended the flaps and slats incrementally through multiple positions, ultimately to 40 degrees. He allowed his indicated airspeed to stabilize at each flap position as he slowed to approach speed. And again, the stabilizer trim was inoperative. That's the pitch trim on this airplane. They are having to really muscle it in each position. They had to kind of assess whether they thought they could handle going to another flap setting and so on. He flew the final approach at 140 knots, completed the landing. He makes a maximum effort stop. However, because of the loss of the left and right AC buses, the anti-skid system was inoperative. The 4 main wheel tires blew out. After the captain completed the emergency engine shutdown checklist, both he and the first officer attempted to go back into the cabin and assist in the passenger evacuation, but were driven back by the smoke and heat thereafter. They exited the airplane through their respective cockpit sliding windows. For what it's worth, that Wikipedia article, and I'm not going to mention or not going to look at it, but says that the captain actually passed out at about this point because of the physical exertion from having to land the DC-9 that was so overwhelmingly out of trim. I'm a little skeptical about that, and this is all the official report says, so I'll kind of be agnostic about that. And as I mentioned already, kind of sadly, when they opened the doors, which obviously you're going to do for an evacuation, nobody would do otherwise, it created something of a flashover situation, and so 23 passengers perished in the fire, even though no passengers, no crew, and no witnesses outside of the airplane saw any flames inside the cabin before the survivors left the plane. And so somewhat tragic. But the only reason I bring this to your attention is electrical fires can be burning through wiring, can have other problems and so on. And again, each airplane's different, each emergency is going to be different. But when you have an onboard fire, you can have all kinds of cascading problems with transponders and electrical buses and who knows what systems are affected and so on. And that just makes it real tough. So in those situations, if the pilot wants to land right now, that's typically what's least bad. And then the last thing we're going to look at is this. I want to compare this briefly to what I'm loosely calling a World War II flyover near DCA. This was the 70th anniversary flyover celebration on the National Mall involving a whole bunch of World War II aircraft, the 70th anniversary of VE Day. And you're going to see some onboard footage from a Grumman TBM Avenger that was just about to kind of roll in a formation flight with some other Avengers right down the National Mall when suddenly they had this happen. I'm going to pause real quick. Every so often in this video, there is a little bit of a pause here and explains what happened. It turns out it was a hydraulic leak from a pinhole problem, but at 1500 psi it was spraying hot hydraulic fluid into the back part of the cockpit, and there was a whole lot of confusion. But let's go ahead and watch this. I'm going to go ahead and mute for a second so everything's proceeding normally. They're coming up on the Georgetown area, getting ready to roll in, coming down the National Mall. Watch how quickly this develops from the first indication of smoke and problems until they actually complete the landing. there was something there you didn't see. So I'm going to back up for just a second so you can see it. But watch what he sees when he swings his head back around to the right. It's hard for me to freeze frame and catch it. It's coming up here in a second. I'm going to mute for a second. He's got 2 passengers in the back of the Avenger as he's coming in on final. About the time he comes in over, and don't ask me what road this is, he looks back to the right, and do you see what he sees? That's one of his passengers who now has his head set off and is slumped over to the side.
Roll the trucks now, roll the trucks now. We'll be stopping about midfield. Roll the trucks, Roger. Who's on fire? Runway 19. Is that lady 3? 83. Kilo bridge. Kilo, copy, bridge inbound. Keep her coming. Company confirmed, lady 3 is gone. Lady 3 is safe on deck. Keep her coming. Lady 3, you're down the river. Switch Potomac. Get out, guys, get out, get out! Get out, get out!
Passenger's not slumped over.
Team is past the bridge. Thank you, sir. Keep her coming.
I'm going to stop here, and they're going to evacuate. It turns out the passenger was not passed out. He was trying to figure out the source of the smoke. They did think they were on fire. He was looking to maybe fight it, and for him to bend down and look where he thought it might be, he had to take his headset off. So this poor pilot turned around, looked, and he thought he saw his passenger slumped over. One of the nice things that this pilot did is he posted occasional notes about lessons and so on. So again, it was a hydraulic leak. It was a hydraulic leak and so on, but it just points out the time dilation of the next 42 seconds. It seemed like 10 minutes. Again, this isn't news to you, but pilots can be very stressed and so on. At first sight, I was in disbelief that this was happening and so on. But I want to take you to this lesson here that's relevant for our purposes at the moment. It's right at about the 4:43 mark. There we go. Lesson 4. After declaring the emergency, I should have shut down the electrical system. A fire in the back of the airplane is likely electrical. Now, that's not what it was this time, but it's likely based on what he would know at the time. A reminder, the airplane will operate normally with the electrical system off and could isolate the source of the fire. So just a reminder for us controllers, if we ever have a pilot who's thinking that they have an electrical fire and they're just very talkative with us, I highly recommend that we tell them, you're clear to land, we're clearing everybody out of the way, we're going to track you on radar using primary targets only, okay? But feel free to shut your master off, because a lot of these pilots, after they land, they go, man, I should have shut down the electrical system, because that can make situations worse. In this particular case, it was a hydraulic leak, and so it didn't make the situation worse, but it could have. For what it's worth, you get some sense, I think it's right about here, of coming up in a second, of the mess from the spray from a pinhole leak in a 1500 psi hydraulic line. All right, well, thank you, Samuel, for sharing with us so that we can learn some lessons. So controllers, in one of these time-pressing emergencies, be decisive, clear them to land, tell them to turn their electrical system off if they need to, and then just deal with it best we can. Thank you.